My name is Raphael, and if someone had warned me of what I was going to face, I might have thought twice before accepting that house. Maybe I would have torn up the letter, politely thanked the lawyer, and gone on with my simple life. But that's not what happened, because at that moment everything seemed harmless. How could I imagine that something so dark could hide under the veneer of normality? I grew up in a small town, the kind that seems to have stopped in time. The streets were always the same, with uneven stone sidewalks and rusty streetlights that hummed in the yellow light. The faces in the windows never changed. The baker, the mechanic, the priest, all seemed to be part of an eternal theater, playing the same roles day after day. It was a routine so predictable that any small event would become the talk of the town for weeks. Still, there was something magical, or perhaps cursed, about that place. A subtle mist hung over everyday life, something that could not be seen but could be felt. As if the past had never really gone away, but had merely hidden itself in the cracks of old houses or under the roots of the old ipes in the city center. And that was where my fascination with the occult began. I was always the curious one in the group. While the other kids were having fun in the square or playing soccer on the dirt field, I preferred to stay in the shade of a tree, listening to the stories whispered by the old women in the neighborhood. Stories that spoke of shadows that appeared at crossroads, of children who disappeared when they entered empty houses, of lost souls who wandered restlessly. Legends that might have been born out of boredom, but that, to me, tasted like truth. I sought fear, not the terror that paralyzes, but that discreet chill, that subtle adrenaline that runs down your spine when the lights go out. It was as if fear connected me to something deeper, more authentic. My friends laughed, of course. They called me crazy when I suggested exploring the abandoned mansion near the cemetery, or when I told urban legends on stormy nights, and I laughed with them. But deep down, I believed they were missing out on the best part of life. Little did I know that one day I would end up in one of those stories. And not as a spectator, I would be the protagonist. It all started with a letter, a yellowed sheet of paper sent by a law firm with a pompous name. The letter informed me that I had inherited a property from a distant relative, a certain Uncle Antonio, whom I only vaguely remembered hearing my mother mention in disconnected conversations. An eccentric, solitary man, passionate about old books and strange collections. According to the lawyer, the house was in a neighboring town, even smaller than mine. A place almost forgotten by time, nestled between hills and surrounded by thick forests. A city where the clock seemed to move slower and silences said more than words. The idea of living in a historic home fascinated me. I felt this strange connection to the past, as if I were somehow part of it. There was something comforting about the sound of old floorboards underfoot, the smell of old wood, the creaking of furniture at night. It was as if I sought refuge in the ghosts of others. I arrived at the house on a cloudy morning. The overcast sky seemed to weigh down the world, and a cold breeze blew through the empty streets. The first sight of the mansion was imposing. The building stood like a reliquary from the last century. Dark wood, arched windows and carved columns covered in ivy that clung like hungry fingers. The windows were covered with thick curtains, and the iron gate creaked like a complaint when pushed. As I entered, I felt the immediate impact. The air inside was heavy, almost solid, a smell of mold, damp wood, and aged paper mixed with something harder to describe, something metallic, perhaps like rust or blood. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, adorned with old paintings whose eyes seemed to follow me. A grandfather clock marked the hours with slow, deep beats, as if each second were heavier than the last. But strangely, I liked it. I felt like I belonged there. It was as if the house accepted me, wrapped me in its invisible arms. A part of me believed, in an almost childish way, that it had been waiting for me. The neighborhood was silent, without laughter, without voices. The houses seemed empty, like abandoned scenes. But there was one constant presence, an elderly woman, always dressed in black, who watched from the window of the house next door. It was as if she never blinked. Her hair was white and messy, falling over her bony shoulders. Her skin was thin and wrinkled like old paper, and her eyes were deep-set and dark, a silent abyss. Her name was Dona Mirtes. Her house was even older than mine, with windows that were always closed and a wild garden taken over by plants that grew without order, suffocating whatever was there. I tried to greet her once, but she didn't respond. She just looked at me, a dry, hard look, as if she was analyzing me from the inside. Curious, I began asking the few locals I came across about her. But whenever her name was mentioned, silence prevailed. People looked away, changed the subject, or simply walked away. One of them even whispered, "Better not to mess with what is quiet." I should have listened. The first night I was awakened by a strange sound. Something scratching the wood coming from the basement. It was low, but insistent. I got up, still a little dazed, and went downstairs with my heart racing. The darkness was dense, almost liquid. As I passed through the living room, I noticed a movement through the window. It was Dona Mirtes, standing in the middle of the yard, watching me. Her face was partially illuminated by the dim light from the street lamp, and there was something wrong with the way she smiled, crooked, forced, as if her face were being pulled by invisible strings. It made me shiver. I yanked the curtain shut and went back into the bedroom, trying to convince myself that it was all just fatigue. But in the following nights, the signs intensified. Doors that I swore I had closed were now open. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallways as I tried to sleep. Objects moved, and the whispers, low, insistent, hissing, as if someone was calling my name from within the walls. And every time that voice spoke, the temperature of the house seemed to drop. My breath came out in cold mists. The lights flickered, and I began to understand. That house was not empty. And Dona Mirtes, perhaps she had never really left where she died. I left the grocery store feeling the world spin around me. The afternoon heat seemed to not reach me, as if my body had been plunged into an icy lake. Mr. Mario's words echoed in my mind with the weight of a curse. She died more than 20 years ago. Each step back to the house seemed harder than the last. The streets, which had been silent before, now seemed complicit in something dark. The windows of the neighboring houses were closed. Curtains moved discreetly. No one looked me in the eye. It was as if everyone knew, as if I had crossed an invisible line, a limit from which there was no turning back. As I walked through the rusty gate of the mansion, I hesitated for a moment. For a second, I wanted not to go in, but something was pulling me inside. It wasn't just curiosity, it was as if the house was calling me, as if it was anxiously awaiting my return. The doorknob was cold to the touch, too cold, and when I turned it, I felt as if I were turning the key to an old safe sealing my fate. Inside the house, the air seemed thicker. The smell was different. There was still the same old mold, but now there was a metallic undertone, like the smell of iron or blood. Everything was in the same place, but something was wrong, as if time had passed in my absence, as if someone or something had moved around, lived there. That night, I tried to go to bed early. I turned off all the lights and locked all the doors and windows. I lay down with my cell phone next to me, the screen facing upwards like a beacon ready to protect me with its artificial light. But the darkness didn't need any gaps to enter. I woke up to a sound that was starting to become familiar. Footsteps. But this time, they were heavier, slower. They were coming from downstairs. The floorboards creaked with each movement, as if the house itself was protesting. I picked up my cell phone with trembling hands and looked at the time. 3:13 a.m. A chill ran down my spine, always at that time, always in that silence. I stood up slowly, feeling the cold floor beneath my feet. I left the room with my heart hammering in my chest and my eyes searching for any sign of movement. The hallway was dark, darker than it should have been. The shadows seemed to stretch on for longer than was possible. I reached the stairs, and then I heard my name being called. It wasn't a distant whisper like before. It was close, very close, behind me. I turned my body quickly, and for an instant, a mere blink of an eye, I saw her. At the end of the hallway, Mrs. Myrtes. Her white hair fell like webs over her pale face. Her eyes, sunken and opaque, seemed not to reflect the light. She stared at me with a subtle, morbid smile, as if she took pleasure in seeing me there, terrified. I ran. I stumbled down the stairs. When I got to the living room, the radio turned on by itself. Static, white noise. But in the middle of it all, a voice said, "You shouldn't have come." I locked the bedroom door and leaned against it, trying to control my breathing. But I knew. She was inside the house. And now it wasn't just her anymore. Over the next few nights, her presence became constant. In the mirrors, I saw reflections that didn't belong to me. Shadows that moved where there was nothing. Voices spoke inside the walls, behind the doors, under the bed. I started leaving lights on. I carried crucifixes, candles, anything that would give me a minimum sense of security. But it was no use. It was as if the house was alive, as if it breathed with me, or against me. I decided to try to find answers. I rummaged through drawers, shelves and boxes in the basement. I found old letters, scribbled in shaky handwriting. They were from Myrtes to her son. Disjointed, obsessive messages. In some, she said he was still there, that she could hear him laughing, crying, calling for her. In others, she spoke of voices that were taking him away, of a creeping darkness that crept into the corners of the house. But the last letter was the worst, which said, "He speaks to me now, but he is no longer my son. The house has taken him, he is within the walls, and soon I will be too." It was then that I understood. The house was a prison, a hospice for souls, an organism that fed on pain, madness and fear. Myrtes never left there because she couldn't, because she belonged there. And now, so do I. The next night, I was awakened by a weight on my chest. My eyes flew open to find her face inches from mine. Her skin was slack and cold, her dead eyes staring at me with an intensity that was impossible to describe. Her mouth opened and a quiet but agonizing sound escaped her. Words in a language that seemed ancient, squalid, corrupt. My muscles locked. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. Then she leaned down to my ear, and she said, "Your turn, Raphael." Everything went dark. When I woke up, it was already daylight. But there was something different. The silence was absolute. I looked around. The furniture seemed older, more worn. The wallpaper was peeling. The house seemed to have aged decades in one night. Or maybe I had aged. I went to the mirror in the hallway. My reflection was there. But behind me, standing, was Myrtes, her eyes on mine. And this time, she smiled broadly. And then I understood. She didn't want to kill me. She wanted me to stay, to take her place, to be the new guardian of the horrors of that house. And now, every night, I hear footsteps downstairs. Someone new has arrived, someone curious like I once was. And I wait silently until he looks out the window and sees me smiling under the yellow light of the street lamp. The world has disappeared. The last thing I remember was Donna Mirte's cold breath brushing my ear as her deep, shapeless voice invaded my senses. It wasn't just a phrase. It was a pact, a seal, a link to something much older than I could comprehend. When she whispered, the darkness closed around me like the lid of a coffin, but I didn't die, or at least not completely. I woke up on the floor of my room with the shy morning sun streaming through the cracks in the window. My body ached as if it had been crushed by something invisible. Every muscle was stiff, and my skin was damp with cold sweat. I staggered to my feet, and something in the environment immediately bothered me. Everything was very different, not in appearance but in essence, as if the world around me was being observed by something other than me, something that now also inhabited that place. And it was from that moment on that reality began to unravel. The clock in the room stopped at 3:13 a.m., the same time the whispers always came, every night, like a ritual. The mirrors, once mere reflections, became distorted portals. When I passed through them, I saw more than my own face. I saw Mirtes's and others. Faces that seemed to rot before my eyes, dissolving in silent agony. And no matter how much I tried to avoid them, the reflections were repeated in the windows, in the water, even on the cell phone screen. The walls of the house began to behave like living flesh. They creaked, yes, but now they also breathed. They swelled and recoiled like lungs. Some nights I heard knocking coming from inside the walls, not like the creaking of old wood, but like nails scratching desperately behind the peeling paint. My mind vacillated between despair and apathy. There were days when I could barely remember my name. Others when I swore I could see my reflection smiling even when I wasn't smiling. One day, I walked into the bathroom and saw the mirror all foggy, even though I hadn't showered. So I wrote, "Who's there?" with my finger, and a new sentence appeared, written from the inside out, as if someone were trapped on the other side. We are, not I, we. That broke me inside. I began to realize that I was not alone, ever. The house had become a receptacle for souls, as if it attracted those who were lost, those who sought fear and found more than they expected. And the figure of Donna Mirtes, she was just the guardian, or perhaps the first victim. One day, while searching the attic, a place I had avoided since arriving, I found a trunk locked with old chains and padlocks. Beside it, a rusty key. My hands trembled as I opened it. The creak of the lid echoed like a scream. Inside, I found diaries. Pages and pages of shaky, desperate handwriting. They were Mirtes's. She described the days after her son disappeared. How she began to hear him through the walls, how he knocked, whispered, wept, and how, little by little, his voice changed, becoming something else, something that was not human. She tried to escape, but the house would not let her. The house trapped her. And she wrote on one of the last pages, in smudged and almost illegible ink, "I am next, but I will not be the last. This house is hungry." Hunger, a simple word that took on a new meaning there. The house was fed, with fear, with memory, with life. That night, I didn't try to sleep. I sat on the living room floor with my back against the wall, holding a lit candle and Mirte's diary on my lap. The candle flickered as if someone was blowing on it continuously. And then, without warning, all the lights in the house went out. The candle went out, and darkness embraced me. Footsteps, slow, wet, almost dragging. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear them, coming down the stairs, getting closer. A harsh breath filled the room. The air became thick as if I were breathing water. Then again, the voice. Only this time, it wasn't just the name. It said, "You are mine." I felt a cold hand touch my shoulder. I turned my body with a desperate impulse, and what I saw will be engraved forever, if I can still use that word. Dona Mirtes was there, but her face was different. Her body seemed to be melting as if it were made of melted wax. But she was still smiling, a smile of relief, of freedom. Behind her, a larger, shapeless shadow, something without a face, without an exact form, hovered over us, and in an instant I understood. She was passing the burden on to me. With the last breath of her name, she disappeared. She dissolved into dust before my eyes, and the shadow entered me. Since that night, the whispers have changed. Now I am the one who hears knocking coming from the basement. Now I am the one who smiles in the mirror when no one else is smiling. The house has possessed me in a way that goes beyond the flesh. It is in me, and I in it. Sometimes I hear footsteps downstairs. Someone new, perhaps curious like I was. A young man walking along the rotten floorboards, looking around, finding everything a little strange but fascinating. And I get up. I walk through the dark hallways. I look out the window under the yellow light of the street lamp and wait for the right moment. When he sees me and smiles back. Because now the house belongs to me. And it is still hungry.